Welcome to the Knock on Archery podcast, where we bring all archers and bow hunters together from all walks of life with the goal to educate, empower, and inspire you to be better both in the field and on the range. James Park, handsome devil. How young are you now?
73, John. Around a few years. That's up to
Nice.
my 63rd year of archery.
That is so impressive. And hey, full disclosure to anyone listening, this call is literally going halfway around the world, so there might be a delay. Please bear with us. Thank you, James, for getting on with me. I've been wanting to connect with you for a while. So give me a little bit of update. What's been going on?
Well, I've in the last few years, I've done a lot of coaching of Australia's compound team. I've also been doing a lot of research in all the matters of where archers lose score, the different physics of how bows and arrows work. So I keep pretty busy.
Yeah, I
I
know
still
you
compete. I still compete quite a bit.
did. So, when did you and I meet 20 years ago at least, huh?
It'd be 2000 and I think we bet 2004 in the World Games in Germany, and
Oh,
then we
that's
had the
right.
great pleasure of having you out at our national championships in 2005 as a guest.
Yeah, yeah, I know. I never got invited back.
The seminars you gave each day were very, very good indeed.
You know what I remember most about that was probably the year that I trained the most. And I think you and I really jived because just prior to that, I was actually working with Easton on the early developments of the Pro Tour. I don't think it was out yet at World Games, right?
I can't remember, John.
Okay, so but you and
Round about.
you were kind of deep down the X10 rabbit
Yes.
hole, and I had already figured that part out. So we
Yeah.
had some really awesome discussions, and I got to come down and shoot in your nationals, which was a full week. It was actually my favorite nationals of any country because you guys shot all formats throughout a week, even clout, even clout. So we
Yeah.
did we did a full FIDA, we did
Yep.
70-meter Olympic round scoring, we did
Yep.
team Olympic round, then we did field marked, field unmarked,
And I think it
clouds.
stood out to me. The thing that stood out to me, John, was your perfect score in the field round.
That was pretty, yeah. And honestly, I haven't totally kept up with it, but I really feel like for an unmarked, that could be the highest unmarked I've
Yeah,
ever shot, just because the X count was incredible.
very, very
In
high.
the
Yeah,
60s. Yeah, in the 60s out of 72.
yeah.
Yeah, what I remember about that was I was really training that year because I think that's when the World Cup teams were the first like actual World Cup teams were going to be named and everything.
Yes.
Um, and so I was shooting a lot at 90 meters, and what I was finding in arrows like drew the two of us together. You were
Yes.
in the process of getting your doctorate, a PhD in arrow flight, correct? Not yet,
Yes.
though.
That's right. Yeah,
Not
that's
yet.
right.
Okay.
Well, I got that. I was granted my PhD in 2012 after some years of study.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
when we were talking, I was doing my preliminary thoughts as to how all that stuff worked, and then I
Yeah. Yeah.
headed off to the university and did it in detail.
You know what I remember about that? I remember the very first round we were practicing, and you guys had us practice at 90 meters at the beginning of the
Yes.
event. Because we were doing a reverse FIDA, right? 90, 70, 50, 30 after lunch. So
That's the
we
order we
did
did.
90
Yeah.
first, 90, 70.
Yes.
So our official practice was at 90, and
Yes.
we shot a full scoring end for practice. And I'm pretty sure I shot a 355 at 90 or something like that. And I
It
remember
was pretty
Clint,
high.
Yeah, I remember
Yeah,
Clint goes because the world record was 392, right? 590. Wait, what was it?
it was, no, you
352?
would have been, I think you were around about the 350, and the world record was, I think, just around about the same.
Yeah, and it was Clint's.
That's right.
Clint had it, and so I know I beat his record by a few points in practice, and it was calm as a cucumber. And he literally looked over to me and he goes, "Do not beat my world record on my own
Yeah,
freaking
yeah,
court." And I'm just
yeah.
like,
Clint's
"No
Clint's
promises."
world record. Yeah, his record was 347.
Oh, that's right. I know I was in the 350s, so that was yeah, that was pretty cool. But we had such an amazing conversation, you and I. We did some seminars on some different topics, but one of the things that really stood out to me was just your understanding of a projectile because I mean, you're a doctor in flight, right?
Aerodynamics. You get your
Yeah.
mouth around that.
So, and were you telling me at the time when you were in that research, were you using Dartfish at the time? What program? Because you were analyzing the
I,
efficiency of my technique a lot, weren't you? You were doing a lot
yeah,
of
that was a
filming.
program I wrote myself that it preceded things like Dartfish. It was a program I developed myself.
And then
Like, since then, things like Dartfish have come along and do similar tasks.
were you combining that with the robotics stuff that you were doing as well? Were you
Yes,
trying to because you weren't able to tell me everything, but I remember you praising my style of archery
yes, it
probably
was very good.
on a completely different level than what most coaches at the time really understood.
Yes, what I was looking very carefully was at the biomechanics and where all the forces were, and yeah, what that would translate through into the impact of errors on your score. And what struck me was that your biomechanics was very very good indeed, which meant that any errors that we all make are not going to affect you as much. Hence, the score
Well,
should be higher.
that might be a problem for all the testing that I'm doing right now. People are just going to be like, okay, Dudley's got some kind of biomechanic phenomenon that's
Yeah,
making this stuff work for him.
yeah,
No, to be honest with you, what's always been my passion, and this goes all the way back to when I came and visited Australia, was giving as much information. Honestly, at that time, most of the countries outside of the US were just not getting the information. All the good shooters were keeping it to themselves. And meanwhile, I was trying to write articles for every single language around the world and trying to do coaching through all the national teams and through World Archery to really expand the knowledge of compound tuning and mechanics. Not to, I
yes,
mean, of course, my coaching technique, but I feel like my coaching technique is, even though I never knew it at the time, now that I've got to know, like when I was in Brazil, one of the founders to the Korean Archery Federation came in and, you know, Coach Kim.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of all need to.
He's very good.
Yeah, he came into my room and he did the same thing. He just said, he sat in on my compound seminar and he said, have you ever studied the Korean archery philosophies? And I just said, no, I never have looked at any of them. And he just said, you're paralleling them. Um,
Yeah,
which, you know, honestly, everything that I've taught just comes from what I don't want to do that makes me miss. You know, that's what I've always wanted to
yeah.
share with people is what makes you miss and how do you avoid that? Because
That's
what I
right.
tell people is the difference in a tournament between, you know, me winning a tournament or Chris White or Dave Cousins or Clint Freeman or Dayon or Pat Coughlin or Seppi, like the names were plentiful, right? When during our era,
Yes,
let's say,
yes,
we all made a mistake.
Yes,
But the ones that were on the podium were the ones that when they made it, they still hung the line, or
that's right.
we couldn't do it twice.
That's
Like
right.
I always expected one, and I would hope that I could land the one, but you just don't have room with these guys to do two.
Right.
So then there lies honestly where you're still at right now by the sounds of it is what makes you miss.
Yeah, that's exactly right, John. What I've done is to try to go through every aspect of both our technique and our equipment and say where do we lose scores and what which ones hurt us, and then what can we do about that?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, if we can understand, for example, the physics of why we lose scores from say backhand, uh, then what can we do about it?
Yeah.
To,
Yeah.
so you take all the big hitters, and then gradually deal with all the others that go along the line as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
For
I
example,
always, yeah.
if I look at just saying John Dudley shooting, the thing that really stood out to me on the biophysics was if I looked at your all your alignment around this area,
Yeah.
you were so
Your release
straight,
hand.
you were so straight around here and so straight here
Yep.
that the mistakes that we make in what we do around here just weren't going to affect you. Uh,
Thank you for
so it's
that.
getting things like
Amen.
that right.
And trust me, I have not paid him to show you that, but yes, the release I use is based on the ergonomics of the hand to where the
Yes,
hand has the ability for some variation without affecting shot accuracy. And
makes a big difference.
what I tell people, as soon as the knuckles round, you are in for a real surprise bag of tricks for
Oh yeah,
for what's going to happen to your accuracy, which is, a lot of these people shooting hinges now, they're really rolling that thing back to a click to where when you look at their hand up and down, it's in a very compromising position before they're
yes.
even into their shot.
Yes, one thing that I have been analysing recently is if you take that arm and bend that wrist a little bit, the lateral forces or the forces away from the line of the arrow become very very high.
Yeah.
So the tiniest little error, you're going to get movement that takes away all the accuracy. For example,
Well, so there's there's a release. There's someone making a release right now that's doing a really good job of marketing against ours. And the thing about it is the distance from the knuckles to the head is very long, which I
no
mean,
good.
I've had people come to me and they're like, I really got suckered into this. I went away from my knock to it and I tried this, but I just don't seem to be as accurate. Why? And
Yeah,
I mean, part of me like just thinks that they're going to come back from an accuracy point of view, but the other part of me wants to say, like, listen, I know a guy that studies literally the shape of the anatomy and how it affects accuracy. And so when I took 2 years off of compound archery to learn recurve archery from Juan Carlos and George Tekmachov, uh, one of the first things they taught me was how to grab the string, and they
yes,
literally showed me on a recurve string on how I grabbed it, and then I literally said, "Dude, this is easy. It's exactly what I'm doing with compound. I want a perfectly straight line." And I tell
very
people
straight.
all the time when I see them, when I look at people shooting, I'm looking at their lines and
Yeah,
you
absolutely.
know what I look
And
for and tell
as
me.
you say, keep that distance short too.
Yeah, yes, yes, absolutely. Amen. Thank you for saying that. So, one of the things I tell people, like when I look at someone shooting, the easiest points that I see, I always just see dots, and I see dots on shoulders, hips, knees, ankles, and I see dots on elbows and wrists. And
Yes,
what I want to see is, literally a T formation where the center two pyramids of the T are running in a straight line to the hips, then to the feet, and the rear arm needs to be parallel to the front so that,
Yes.
as you're pulling down. So when people start to, lose that elbow a little bit down and out, all that
Yep.
starts to affect the direction of the release hand when it naturally busts loose of the string.
Sure
And
does, John.
so I tell people, I don't know what the lock time is now. I know at one time, well, at least on that, so on that, I was shooting an Apex when I was with you, right? I probably had an Apex and X10 410s, I would
Yes,
guess.
that's right. Yes, I can call that.
So I think the lock time on that bow is probably around like 18 thousandths of a second, something like that. And what I tell people is, for 12 to 13 thousandths of that second, the string is still within my face. And
Yeah, that's right.
once the release cracks. So for 3/4 of that sound that you hear, you actually have the ability to make a bunch of micro mistakes that are going to magnify more and more and more, depending on how far you shoot for one. Uh, Obviously, any part of your technique, whether it's follow through, facial pressure, shoulder position, what you're doing with your grip, that's all going to have a huge factor. But then on top of that, if you vary at all in any of those mechanics, now your projectile starts to also reflect those things downrange.
Yes.
So, how many high speed or aero flight videos do you think you have watched?
Oh, some hundreds. And I've usually watched them frame by frame.
I was gonna say you've had how many? You've had hundreds of students. I know
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
hundreds of
Yes.
students, and I know when you're working with the national team, you guys were always big on. You guys had people that had good aeroflight. Come, if they couldn't shoot, I knew that they would at least have good aeroflight. Was that?
Yeah.
I feel like that was always Clint's thing too.
Yes.
Clint was an aeroflight fanatic, right?
Yes. It was always very, very good. And yeah, it's important.
Because even his loops that he would make and everything would like he would change a loop style just so that his aeroflight would be what he needed to with a release that he
Yes.
was shooting at the time.
Yes. Yes.
And
Yeah.
so everyone out there listening, Clint Freeman is actually the first person to shoot the 90 meter. Well, no, he was the first 1400, but then he
Well,
shot
first
the night
1400
first
at 10,
1400 ever, and
10,
then
10,
owned the
10 world
90.
records.
Is that what he had?
Yeah,
10?
10. Yeah, 10 world
Yeah,
records. Yeah.
he
At one
was
stage,
he was
he had the
awesome.
record for every distance.
Yeah, yeah. And so I wish we had Clint on here too. I need to get a make sure Zoom goes into Tasmania and get Clint. But
Yeah.
for him during those times, do you know, was his tuning process always more about the groups than it was anything else? Did you ever ask him?
I don't have it that in detail. Like I've shot with a Clint a large amount. Regrettably, he always tended to beat me, which was annoying. But
Dude,
shot
he's
with him a
awesome.
lot. Yeah, during my best years, that was also Clint's best years. So he was a tough competitor. Like he was shooting a 1440 round every day,
Right.
uh, and so he was putting it in, a world worth of effort. And he was very particular about arrow flight. Exactly his tuning procedure, I'm not certain, but yeah, it was very, very good.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the things that I'm kind of going to dedicate some time to right now is trying to open people's minds, at least have a two-way avenue to where people can think about aeroflight not necessarily
Yes,
from a absolute of, well, if you want to pass through an elk, you have to have this, and you need to have this much FOC, and I feel like it's really important for the hunting side of our house as an
yes,
industry to recognize what the target archery side of the house is learned from a ballistics and an accuracy point of
Yes.
view, and then try to
Yes.
find the middle ground to where the person that is just a hunter or the person that's going to these tack events or like a Reading style event where you're shooting longer yardage, to where you start to understand the gives and the takes, the pros and the cons, and the apples and the oranges. And unfortunately, right now, there's so many people in the digital realm that are they're showing apples to apples to give a person with common sense, this idea of, oh, well, this total, like, I need to be doing it that way. Yeah, that totally makes sense. But the reality is there's a very, very important middle ground to this whole equation, and how arrows work and what they need to do, in order to go down range, because it's not just an overall arrow weight, and it's not just a percentage in the front of that arrow that is going to make
No.
you accurate. And I just keep preaching as a hunter. Listen, as a hunter, my target moves in target archery. If there was someone down there that could move my target up or down, when as long as they could move it once my shot went off, they were allowed to move it up or down. Listen, I'd be shooting even faster. I probably wouldn't have shot X10s. I probably would have went for the ACEs even on the feeder rounds. And
Yes, you would.
you know what I mean? Just because I would have wanted the speed just to make do for reaction.
Yes.
So, in this case, like I said, this test that I just did, for me to go from a 500 to a 600 grain arrow at 80 yards, there is a 10-yard difference in sight
It's a
scale.
big change, isn't it, John?
So for me to shoot a 510 grain arrow at 80 yards, I would have to, or if I was at 80 yards, I could, with a 610 grain arrow with my sight in the same spot, I would have to step up 10 yards to hit the center. It's 10 yards you'd have to walk up, people, to hit the center without moving your sight, with 100 grains different in
Yes.
that arrow. So when you're talking about an animal that is reacting either to the sound of the bow, which is normally the first reaction, which in most cases is them looking at you or looking the direction of the sound, but then on the second sound, which would be your fletchings or an inbound projectile of the broadhead, that 100%, if they have the two different sounds from the same location, that is triggered a fight or flight reaction. And now they're spinning and moving and getting out of the way. Whereas if the only noise they hear is either the projectile coming in or the sound of the bow, well, now their first reaction is, what is that sound and where's it coming from? And by then it's too
Yes.
late. But if you
Yes.
have two sounds on top of one another as a hunter, this is a disastrous scenario. So I was hoping you could kind of shed some light on some of this, and how when people focus on the accuracy of their arrow, what what are the key things to think about, and what are some of the things that you don't see people thinking about, or some of your students that they need to?
When like I have analysed a lot of that, not from a hunting point of view, but from a target archery point of view. But as you say, it's very strongly related. I think, as you
Right.
say,
Yeah, yeah, it is. It
um,
is.
like the thing that kills you on the target range is wind drift.
Yeah.
Uh, and so what that says for a target arrow is you want it to be skinny and heavy. Uh,
Yeah.
but 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 you do know what the distance is, very accurately.
And see, that's the only other thing is, like, imagine, so imagine as a hunter,
You
you
don't know the
range an
distance.
animal, and then by the time you set your sight and it gives you the angle you want, well, now it's taken 2 or 3 steps, and you really
That's
don't
right.
want to have to rearrange and
No,
redo. So now
no.
this
Now,
becomes an issue, right?
yeah, oh yes, it does. Now, the other thing I have analysed is field archery. Uh,
Right. Which is
again, from
relative.
the point of view of fixed targets, not moving animals. Now, of course, in field archery, we don't always know the distance. the World Archery round, you don't know the distance for some of the targets. And so what that then says is, and you probably haven't got as much wind.
Right.
So the thing that matters then is, can you get a bit more arrow speed so that you get remove some of the distance uncertainty.
Right. Right.
So for example, what that's then saying to me is that you'd use a small diameter arrow, but not so heavy,
Right. Right.
so that you can keep that speed. So as you say, that sight gap is not so severe.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well, like for me, I shoot an arrow that's over 500 grains. It's normally with a
yep,
lighted knock around 529, I think.
yep,
But I shoot 75 pounds and I've got, 30.5 inch draw, sometimes 31, depending on what type of clothing I'm using. So I'm in a little bit different category than everybody else, but I also, I just want people to realize like for the longest time, an Axis or an FMJ or some of the old Beemans, ACCs. An ACC was probably one of the most awesome hunting arrow, back
yes,
in that time, but it was light, that
yes,
ACC were in the mid 400s. And, when you look at a lot of the hunters all through that era, they were all being very, very efficient with that arrow. And it was, in the low fours to the low fives for arrow weight.
yes,
Now, certainly when
yes.
people went to Africa or if someone's going for, like a water buffalo, say in Australia, you definitely need to start paying attention to what you have on the front. You're going to need a
Sure.
cut on impact. You're not going to want a massive expandable on a large game animal. And certainly
No.
the lighter you go in the arrow, the more you need to recognize that, you can't shoot 50 pounds with a 27-inch draw and go try to shoot, 450 grain arrow with a 2-inch expandable like that. Anything small game or better, yeah, antelope or smaller. But if you start getting a big whitetail, at a mid-range distance, 40 to 50 yards, well, yeah, now if you hit solid bone mass, there's going to be a problem. It's going to be a problem. So I don't know. I always look at the hunting situation as, when I look at an animal, I kind of look at it as like a target bale. If a bale is sitting in a frame, 90% of it, I can shoot an arrow in there and I might bury to the fletchings, or I might hit something and not go in very far, but it's not going to do any major like damage. But if I hit the frame, like, it's just not going in. It's
Yep.
gonna, and I think that way too. It's, I look at an elk and I'm like, okay, 10% of this animal, I don't want to hit it. I don't want to hit it. It's rock hard, it's dense, and what I want to do is be so dang accurate that I am more likely to hit the 90% than if I hit that 10. And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
when I hear people say, "Well, I want a 600 grain arrow, what if I hit the shoulder on an elk?" Well, certain part of the shoulder or a knuckle or an arm bone, honestly, even for a 27-inch draw shooter shooting a 600 grain arrow, he's probably not going through the humerus bone of an elk
No,
anyway.
no, yeah. The accuracy is
Right,
a bit more important, isn't it?
right, right. So tell me this, when it comes to speed, and we talked a little bit about lock time, how important is that speed to kind of making up for some of your flaws in compound archery? Because I remember talking to one of our Olympians here years ago, and he actually was shooting outdoor arrows for Vegas. And I said, "How come you're not shooting the fat diameter shafts?" And he just said, "For me personally, I feel like this arrow getting off my string faster is actually more accurate for me than trying to shoot the big shafts that are
Yes.
taking longer to get out of my string."
Yeah, I think the important factor there, John, is we can consider things like wind drift and FOC and etc. But ultimately, for example, wind drift, a heavier arrow is always going to drift less, but the thing's still got to group well. If it doesn't group well, then there's no advantage.
Right.
So I would always go down the road of saying, what does the physics tell me I should do? But then I'm sure as anything going to grip test it and tip usually with my shooting machine. And for
Right.
example, if I went to an extreme weight of arrow, uh, that might give me, for example, more energy downrange, or it might give me.
We're breaking up a little bit, everybody, but bear with us. We should be able to sift through the patchiness. You there,
I think
James?
No,
Okay.
sorry, I'm back again, John. Yes,
Okay.
I guess I think I lost you for a moment. What I would always do is to say, uh, ultimately, my choice has got to group.
Yeah,
Uh, that
big time.
if for example I go to a say I went to a very heavy point to get less wind drift, that might get me less wind drift, but it might not group.
Right. Right.
Uh, and so there may be no point in going to that sort of change, because it's going to hurt my score anyway.
Right.
Uh,
Yep.
so some of these extreme things that I see people do, I wonder if they're being wise in, have they actually tested that the thing actually still groups as well. You're into an example. For example, if take a recurve using say X10s versus big aluminiums, the aluminiums will, for example, cut the lines more, but they might not group.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Well, so I actually I shot I had a field bow that I was working on. It shot so freaking good. And I really didn't want to change the blade, the launcher blade on it. I was afraid to even unscrew the blade and put a new one on and try to put this
Yeah,
one back in the same spot. And so and I actually just posted this picture the other day, but I ended up shooting a 30x 300 round with X10s. They might have been Pro Tours, but they were one of the two. And I
yeah,
mean, it was an inside out round. And so,
yeah,
that's when the question comes up. It's like, listen, of course, like you know, why am I not thinking about this? Because if I have a wild shot, yes, the diameter is going to help me. But the reality is, when
sure.
you really go through the tuning process of seeing how an arrow groups at 90 meters, and for probably 5 years of my life, I would say 80% of my shooting was at 90 meters because it was the biggest microscope I had on my
Yes,
technique. And everything about my technique and how I polished my technique was really based on how could I make these arrows that grouped this good when I was shooting perfectly? How could I minimize that one or two wild ones and still hold a
yes,
10 or maybe a 9, right? But not, holding gold is much different than, hitting some reds, because obviously you hit one
sure.
red, now you're like on the, you're on the cut line, at least with the savages I used to compete with.
Yes,
Um, so do you think, uh, my observation, and I right now I'm shooting these events called Total Archery Challenge, and honestly, it's not pros. There's a few pros there, but it's grassroots archers is really what it is. But a lot of these guys are showing up with either bows that they've got set up from a shop and they just went in and said, just give me what I need, or some of these guys I can tell that are starting to do their own arrows, and maybe they started with some of ours and then now they're going down some of these other avenues to where there's some pretty appealing clickbait out there. But I honestly, when I stood back this last year, this was the worst arrow flight year I've ever spectated from behind 10,000 people watching arrows go up, and I was almost always at 100-yard target. I mean, it seems like these people that would step up and have this huge growth on the front of their arrow so that they would have this ridiculous FOC number. What happens is the point is for sure tracking, but the back end of the arrow is just kind of moving around this center point of
Yeah.
mass trying to figure out how to correct itself. So like what's your from literally just a physics and doctor of aeroflight point of view, what's happening when I see that?
Well, if as you add more point mass, of course, the arrow is going to flex more.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, for
It
sure.
must.
Yeah.
uh, and yeah, if you get too big a flex, you can get things happen that are not nice in the way the arrow behaves. Uh,
Because I remember
and
you
you get,
guys talking about a snake bend. I
yes,
remember a lot of the early, very high speed, slow motion footage we did of different teams, and
yes,
I know Kesik Lee and everything was filming me back in the day. And when they watched me and Dave Cousins shoot, our arrows were always in like a perfect paradox,
yes,
and then they would start
yes,
rotation, whereas some would flex dramatically, and then it would create this like a snake
yes.
bend where
I have looked at that. I have looked at that one, John. What's happening there is that there are multiple modes of flexing of the arrow. There's what would be called the first mode, which is the normal flex,
for a
and the
compound archer, it would be an up and down paradox.
usually
Okay.
or recurve, it will be sideways.
Right.
The next mode that comes along is the second mode. It's sort of a uh,
It's
it's a
like doing
higher
the
frequency
wave.
mode.
It's like a crowd in the stands doing the wave. That's
Yeah,
literally
that's right.
your
And so that will be the second mode of flexing.
yeah.
And so it's where you get too much of that second mode that you get that S shape.
Yeah.
And so what would be then would be you and Cousins would have been getting primarily the first mode,
Yep.
and the ugly ones have been getting a bit too much of the second mode. Uh,
Yeah. And so
uh,
when you have too much flex in mode 2 of the cycle,
yes, then you
so
get
at
the
that
S
point, are you
shape.
putting more, you would have to be putting more emphasis as that snake hits the front, it's going to put more emphasis on what the heck that front's doing. If there's a broadhead in there, well, now you've got a bladed object pointing in a weird direction.
Yes,
If it's on the back, depending on the type of fletch you use, obviously you could fully take away or give a boost to any type of steering that the front is doing versus the back. So then that's
oh
when
yes,
it
you
gets
can.
pretty spicy.
Oh yes, you can. That gets very complicated, and it can get ugly. It's much gentler if the thing behaves for example um, like a more normal flex.
Right, right,
Uh,
right.
Now, like I say, if you go to things like, for example, extreme point weights, some of those ugly things can start to happen. For example,
Yeah, well, I've
or
seen
if you
that.
don't tune the bow very well, you can get some of those ugly things happen as well.
You know, one of the things that well, you just, I always tell people, you don't tune a bow, you tune arrows, you set up a bow.
Yeah,
Um,
that's right.
you know, I always, and what's funny is through some of these tests I've done over the last several days, I'm shooting like multiple offsets, right
Yes.
hand, left hand out of the same bow. I'm shooting yesterday. Did you see the video I did yesterday? Yesterday I shot a group at 70 meters with four arrows. Two of them had 1.5 degree and two of them had 3 degree helical, and they just shot, you know, the threes were a
Yep.
little bit lower, which, you
Yep.
know, the further you go and the more degree
Yep.
you have, the lower they're gonna get. But what I'm trying to
Yes.
show people is like on the first day, I showed them stuff with a 5 millimeter arrow with a 4 inch or with a 3 inch flat four fletch. Then on day two, I went to a 6 millimeter arrow with a much different point weight configuration and a three fletch with a Easton factory three fletch offset. And I showed them, I'm like, listen, for most people can't outshoot those groups that I did live. So it's like,
Yeah.
if you can't do that, it's hard for you to argue with me the
Yeah, I agree.
historical data that I've done with people like yourself. And this isn't even factoring in the countless years I've trained with people that are better than me. The Dave Cousins, the Clint Freemans, the Chris Whites, the freaking Dayon Sitars, the Morgan Lundins, the Martin
Yeah,
Damsbows,
yeah, they're good.
freaking Peter in the Netherlands. Like I grew up during a very difficult time where people were still trying to learn equipment and learn how to set world records. And with all these people,
Yeah,
when we practiced together, there just was no room for having something that wasn't well thought out. And people just really went to what grouped rather than just trying to fixate on certain numbers, because the reality is the combinations are so endless that, you know, the great thing is we can tune an arrow to a bow, and the bow doesn't have to move, and it'll probably do pretty good. Now, if you put the one thing I'll tell people, they were like, well, what if your arrow flight wasn't perfect? A lot of people are saying, well, you probably weren't getting a bullet hole when you switched
yes.
shaft diameters and everything. And I'm like, you know what? I know that I wasn't, but so then what I did was I actually showed the video of uh I showed a video of the bow that you watched me shoot at nationals. And that bow was the most fantastic grouping bow possibly ever at anything up to 90 meters. And because I shot the field round with it too.
Yeah.
I cleaned a field round. I think I cleaned two field rounds, but I cleaned the unmarked. No, did I miss one on the marked?
I think you got the marked one, you got clean. I remember watching your last shot and you had to get it in and you got it in. So I'm sure you got the marked one clean.
Okay. So yeah, because the marked is actually the hardest, right? Because it's the
Yes, it
longest
is.
distances. Okay.
Yes,
So
it is.
um so yeah, I mean, that bow was just shooting fantastic at anything from 10 to 90 meters,
Yes.
and literally shooting X's on bunny dots, which are the size of the 10 ring of a Vegas face. Shooting
Yes.
X's on those. Actually, I think I cleaned every X inside of 40 meters.
Yeah.
So that thing was all about how it grouped at long range, and everything added up. Now, with in saying that, I can definitely say that I've had bows that have shot fantastic at the longer distances, but were a little bit more squirrely at 30 meters. And by that, I remember specifically I was trying to get more speed because I really wanted the X10s for field. And, I think I missed one on the unmarked round with you guys. But, if I had 10 feet per second more, I wouldn't have missed that dot
Yeah, that's right.
because of my miscalculation. So what I was trying to do was I was trying to find a 450 with a rear cut configuration that would mirror my 410 configuration, but the lightness of the 450 versus the 410 would have gave me the speed that I needed. So I was desperately trying to find a perfect recipe on a 450 that was cut differently to match the exact recipe I had on the 410. But what I found was once I weakened up, because I was right on the border of being too weak, my shorter distances were just a little looser than when I had that
Yes.
perfect match for the longer one. So for
Yes.
me, when it came down to me documenting my scores, I'm like, listen, yes, if I'm off 2 yards with this heavier arrow, I'm going to miss a point on an unmarked round. However, my X count is so much higher that if I make a 80 percentile shot, I'm still holding the five versus, and by that, the five is the highest score on a feet of field face, by the way, people. You're shooting arrows at, the max score in the middle is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1,
Well, I think
0.
I think then it was 5. Yeah, now it's changed to a 6, but then it
Yeah,
was
right.
5.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, I had to just look at my results on paper and realize I'm actually better off, because this one group's better and it lets me get away with a bad shot. And that's one thing I
Yep.
stress to people is you really need to know your shot on a scale system. So if you know what a perfect archery shot is, or if you know what your perfect archery shot is, I always say, in my mind, that's a 10. When someone says, "How did you shoot today?" I'm going to come off around and say, I shot 67 good ones today. And that might not mean I'm only 5 off. What that might mean is technique wise, I was very satisfied with 67 of my shots. But
Yep.
what you need to do is you need to find that build to where when you have a shot that's an 8 out of a 10, you're still getting an A on the test and not getting a B. Because
Absolutely.
when it comes to forgiveness, every bow might not be the same, but certainly your arrow's combination to that bow is
Yes.
100% going to result in what many would refer to as forgiveness.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, I agree with that, John.
So for you, where do you start with students? On I and this is going to obviously be from the target side of the house, people who are listening, but I hope you realize that we're literally talking to someone with a PhD in aeroflight. How many different articles have you had published
um,
scientifically in relations to your research? This
in
isn't
the
like
professional
one paper,
journals,
by the the way. Yeah, exactly.
professional journals, it's 31, John.
Okay, 31 professional journals. So, yeah,
31.
it's just
Yeah.
this is getting hard for me to bite my tongue on this subject because there's listen, there's for sure a few dozen people that can come here in my yard and beat me right now. I'm not myself when I was in my 20s. But there's also a lot that are given opinions that I know cannot. And when it
Yes.
comes to hunting, there's definitely ones between myself and some of my friends that have been on my podcast. You're talking about, I probably have 10 friends that could easily be thousands upon thousands of animals. And none of those are telling people that they have to have a certain percentage of FOC in order to be lethal as a bow
No.
hunter. And
No.
and what's disturbing is all those people that are successful are accuracy fanatics. So
Yeah.
James, what if you have someone, what are some of the key things they need to really consider when choosing an arrow or the right arrow?
Right now, so the game I'm generally dealing with, so John, is normally target archery or field archery. And so if we're dealing with target archery, what I'm wanting them to do is to first go to a small diameter arrow.
Yep.
So I'll be normally aiming at something like an X10 or a Pro Tour.
Right, right,
Then I want to use the standard normal point. So I'd be generally aiming at the 120 grain point, unless they're using a very lightweight arrow. Then I might go
right.
lighter.
Yep,
But typically, for someone like me, I'd be going. Oh yeah, no, I'm normal, standard 6 foot archer using 60 pounds and 29 inches. I'd be going, something like a 380 or so with 120 grains,
right,
and then I want to go with from point of view of fletches, I want a small fletch angle, not zero and not extreme. Now,
okay.
I too often see people going with zero, and they're
Oh,
giving away hand
the
over fist doing
knuckleball.
that. I'm
Nice.
wanting people to go to about 1 degree of angle,
Yep.
uh,
Okay.
not an extreme angle. So
Right.
what I'm wanting there is people to spin their arrow a couple of times in the shortest distance they shoot, and about 1 degree will do that.
Right.
Uh, uh, and then if I was talking, say, a field archer, where you might have the unknown distances and you've got hills, uh, you haven't got as much wind. So
Right.
I'm saying what we then want to do is we want to get to get up a bit more arrow speed to take out some of that distance uncertainty or hill uncertainty. Now, so for example, I shoot both compound and recurve. If I shoot recurve, recurve arrows are slow. If I shoot my X10s on recurve and I make a distance error, it kills me. So, for example, on recurve, I'm saying arrow speed matters immensely, so I would shoot ACEs.
Yeah.
But again,
For field, for
then
field.
I'm not for field, and I'm not going to go to an extreme point weight because I want the
Right.
arrow speed. Because I want my sight gap to be down so that I'm taking away the uncertainty. Now, I guess that's similar to when you're hunting. You don't want that uncertainty. It's the same sort of deal.
Yeah. Yep. But see, the thing is here, so here in a hunting situation, here's where the trade-offs start. So for those of you listening, James is talking about he probably would have used 120 grain tungsten point, but he's also probably going
Yes,
with like a 187 vein, so a 1.87 vein or a
yes.
175 possibly. Maybe a PM 2.0 if he was just doing field to where you were 60 meters or less, you could go with that's, am I right?
Yes, John. I'm not
Okay.
overdoing the fletch.
Okay.
I'm using
Okay.
just enough fletch so it gets me
Right. Okay. Okay.
good
So
enough.
So, from a hunting point of view, for those of you listening, here's the difference. So, obviously, at one time, people for sure would put an aluminum insert in these arrows, which was almost 20 grains and a 100 grain point. And listen, the only thing any of you ever thought about was, do I want a 100 grain head or a 125 or a 150? Now that there's heavier inserts, and one of the things that I did when I first started shooting the Axis was I was begging Easton to make brass inserts so that I could choose a 50 or a 75 grain brass insert, which would make up for the weight that I'm putting on the rear of a shaft in the bigger fletch so that it would make up for the need that I had in that bigger fletch to steer a broadhead in the front of the arrow. So if you look at it, I'm not being super precise, but if you think about it, when James is talking about a 120 point and this fletch that's 2 inches, you almost have these two things that are about similar in length, if I'm honest. But then when you put a vinyl crest and you put a four fletch of a 3 inch vein on the back of an arrow, well, now you definitely do want to offset that front of center and you need to load a little bit more. So for me, that's when the 50 and the 75 grain came in with the option of a 100 up to a 150 screw in point. I felt like that was awesome media ground. I honestly felt like I was having almost the same accuracy as what I was having with the target bow, but I had an 8 inch stabilizer and no magnification of my lens, and I had a 3/16 peep sight, and my equipment was more tailored for hunting. But what I was doing was trying to slightly skew the formula to make up for the slight variations that we have now.
It sounds good strategy to me, John.
Okay, okay. So one of the things that I tested quite a bit when I started doing the longer range stuff was vein offset. And because what happened was in field, when you have a 10-meter bunny target and then you've got to go to the 60 meter or
60.
66 yards, and then if I needed to take that same bow to, like, let's say I was traveling to Australia, I didn't want to have to travel with a field bow and a FITA bow. I really was trying to build crossover bows. So I went through this whole thing of what do I need to do in order to get this ballistic that's awesome for long range? What do I need to do to correct it fast enough to where it can shoot in the mid range too? What I found is when my angle was too steep, one, there start to become an issue with clearance. But now with
Yes.
limb driven style rests, which most people are using, that can somewhat factor out. But then the next thing is what I realized, and I really realized this when I did testing for Easton with the QAD quick spin vanes, because at one time we were actually going to offer those quick spin vanes as the pre-fletch vane, like the vane on pre-fletch arrows, the little high profile 2-inch. But what happened was, and I remember a couple 3D shooters who were actually getting paid by NAP showed up to the Gold Cup and the Arizona Cup with those small 1.5-inch quick spin vanes. And what happened was, as soon as they hit the 90-meter mark, that it just their scores, and honestly what they were capable of, these archers were capable of much more than that. But Cousins and I just looked at each other like, don't tell them, but their arrows spinning too fast, it's
Yeah,
decelerating too quickly, and you can see the distances where they're freaking tight, and then all of a sudden they start to balloon out and the arrow starts to lose its speed, and the accuracy starts to default. So what's your thoughts on that, James, from a scientific point of view?
well, I've done lots and lots of testing of fletch angle, uh, and you can overdo it. Yeah,
You
first you must
can,
have
you
some.
said you can overdo it, correct?
Can overdo
Okay.
it.
Okay.
Like you must have some angle, otherwise they're not as accurate. They simply don't grip as well. But what I've come to think is that about 1 degree or so is plenty.
Yeah.
So yeah, 1 degree is going to at the 10-meter target. It's going to spin your arrow a couple of times, which is plenty, and it's not going to overspin it down the range. Down the range, as you say, if you overspin it, the long range accuracy just goes away.
Yeah.
So I don't want people to overdo this fletch angle.
I'm gonna just grab 2 arrows quick, James. Let me come right back. 1 second. So, for those of you watching, I don't know if we'll actually do the video on this, but hopefully we will. So, I just grabbed 4 arrows real quick that I saw. Uh,
Yep,
this arrow right here, this yellow one, I know is what I used in 05, 06. And uh,
that's
so
got
I'm going to hold this up for those of you who are looking on the camera, and I'll try to get it to where James can look at it and
yeah.
tell
So
me. Well,
that's
we know what it did.
yeah.
It,
That's looking to me
it
like
broke
it's
some
got something like
Australian
about
records and won me a bunch of
yeah,
gold medals that weekend.
yeah. It looks like it's got something like about 1 degree, is it, John?
Yeah. Okay. So here is the arrow that Cousins and I shot for field. Um,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
here's our arrow that I shot for field. So every
yeah,
field medal that I
yeah.
won was with this arrow.
What type of shaft is that one, John?
I ended up going with an X10.
Okay.
So this is a
Oh, so that looks like it's got about the like if I take an
look at the
X10.
difference. Yeah, so this is a 410 with this was a 410 with a full 2.5 off the back.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah,
but I was able to do that. I could do 2 full off the back with a full 120 tungsten in this one. Now, see on this
yeah.
other one, because, and this is going to get a little deep for people listening. So the a tungsten as a material is very dense, very heavy. So
Yes,
the distance that this arrow goes inside of this arrow shaft is very short.
very short. Mm.
Okay, versus the stainless steel points, which although these weren't as durable and sometimes could bend in a target, what I found was even though I did not want to shoot these, okay, everybody, these are the cheap points. Even though I did not want to shoot these,
They're pretty good.
because the length of the shaft was different, and when it goes, once this goes internal into the arrow shaft, then the point of your flex on the arrow starts to change differently because you've actually stiffened more of the front portion
Yeah.
of this arrow. So instead of when this thing is shot and it's flex, right? So right there would be kind of an ideal paradox, correct, James?
Yes, yes, John.
And honestly, just so everyone, if anyone's watching, if I do put this video out, so when this flex is up and down like this, there's actually a point where the rear, if you have a perfectly straight line across, there's a point where the rear and the point are crossing the same horizontal plane. And we referred to that as the node, correct, James?
Yeah, the nodes would be grab myself an arrow.
Yeah, yeah. So when this is
No, the
flexing,
nodes would be about about there and there.
yeah, and that can change. You can change your node based on the length of your arrow shaft. You can change that node depending on the length of the shank that's going internally.
And the
So
point mass.
yeah, the weight of the point obviously decides this. So the point, so one of the things, this is going a little bit even deeper. Some people, and myself included, have even tested on where the launcher needs to be in relation to the actual node of that arrow according to how it's reacting to the bow that is projecting it. So again, I did not want to
Yes, it
like
will
go
change.
down this rabbit hole with people because I feel like I'm going to confuse a buttload of people. But what I'm really trying to do is just say, everybody trust me. James wants to make the world better. I want to make the archery world better. James, you think it's fair to say I could shoot any archery brand in the world that I would want?
Oh, I think so, John.
Okay. And do you think, based on what you see, I'm picking ones that I think I'm going to be the most accurate with?
Yeah, I think so.
And true, and in all fairness, I will say this: I've been with Easton a long time. Other arrow companies have come a long way. There's some great arrows from some other manufacturers out there. Now, in the target side of the house, James's side of the house on this screen right now, no one's got anything that's going to compete with this
No,
baby. Like
no, it's the best.
Easton owns
Yeah,
long range. They own long
I've
range.
uh, I've analysed them all, John, and the arrow you got in your hand is the best.
I know. I've seen the data, and I
It's
don't
also
share. I
it's
don't
also what
share.
I've got in my hand.
Yeah, yeah. These things are spectacular. Okay,
Yeah,
so I showed everybody
on
this.
that Fletch angle, John. Let me show
Yes.
you. I'll show you the angle I've got on mine. Can you see that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So that's
Now,
probably 175 maybe on that
yeah, now
particular
that's
one.
yeah, it is, and like this is actually an arrow I shot in 1999 and won our national championships.
Oh,
But you can see
nice.
I've got there about uh, that'll be about a bit over 1 degree.
Yeah, and that's is that a flex fletch like a is
Yes,
that
it
a
is. It's a flex
2
fletch. It's a flex
2.0?
fletch. It's
Was that a
one.
2.0?
It's one and three quarter.
1 3/4? Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so I just showed you guys that vein. Now I'm going to show you. So this right here is what I shot at TAC. So at TAC, I'm shooting. I honestly want more of a hybrid setup, James. I don't want to go out there looking like a total target guy. So I'm
yep,
trying to build something that's a crossover. So I could hunt with this Sonic KE arrow if I wanted. I would just put a longer fletch on there and I would put more point weight in the front.
sure.
For I've got 150 total in the front for my tack. So I have a 50 grain brass, 100 grain screw in. I'm shooting a
Yep,
187 in the back, and this is set it right at about 2.5 degrees. But for me, this is a very good compromise for my hunting arrow. I can clear
and
130
it's
yards with it.
plenty. It's plenty of fletch angle. You don't need any more than that.
Okay, so now listen to me a little bit, and you're either gonna tell me I'm wrong, or you can understand why I did this. So here's an arrow. This right here is an arrow that we sell, and this is how we set up every bits and burger jig that we sell.
Yep.
So this is a 4 fletch, mainly for the, for the hunters out there. It's a 4 fletch, and this is set at 2.5 degrees. And the reason it is because people have to steer a magnitude of broadheads. Some of them are very fixed blade oriented. Some of them are mechanical oriented. But more importantly to me, when it comes to a projectile for hunting, is the audible sound. So what I've found is with a 4 fletch, and especially when the front of the lead vein is right at the back edge of the rear vein, when this is turning, it's more like a ceiling fan that's moving air rather than chopping air. So the audible sound on this fletch in this configuration is the quietest that I can personally build this way. So again, I'm not comparing apples to oranges, but what I'm doing is I'm trying to take an orange and I'm trying to use the apple and the orange philosophy to try to give you something that is giving you the best of both based on the application that this is intended for. However, even though a Bitzenberger can go to 3.5, the 3.5 like this becomes diminishing return once again. This is going to start to parachute. It's going to start to
I
decelerate.
I think you've got plenty of offset there, John. I wouldn't go to any more than that.
No, no, that's max. And with just what I
Yeah.
found from testing with the microphone is, when there's space between, it seems like it builds an ability to whistle or have
Yes.
an audible like that, versus it seems like the more I cross them over, um, the more it's just like, it just takes that away. So
Yeah.
that's the method to my madness. So please tell me
Yeah.
whether it was right or wrong.
Like your game, hunting game, you're trying to optimize a little bit differently to my game.
Yeah.
And so the sound for you matters a lot. Doesn't matter to me much at all for the target game.
Yeah, no kidding.
um, but looking at that arrow, that you've got plenty of fletch angle, that's going to work.
Okay.
So if you're there, if you've optimized it there for the sound, also from the point of view of how much you're spinning in the arrow, it looks to me like you've got it pretty good as well. You
Yep.
don't need any more angle than that.
So, James, did you ever read my article on the Hill method? Or did
No,
I talk to you about that when I talked to you
no, I
about
haven't.
the
I've not,
horizontal impact line? Or when I
I'm
was
familiar,
doing
but
my,
yeah,
okay,
I've seen a little bit of it, John.
okay. Um, so during a lot of my testing during that era, which was a decade,
Yeah,
um, and what people need to realize too is when you work for a bow manufacturer, and especially when you're one of the lead people that are reporting the accuracy of those bows to the companies, that means you're setting up something that doesn't necessarily tune. It's literally, this is a concept. They haven't figured out string placement, riser angle, like that stuff isn't figured out. So when I have to build this thing that's the first one ever out and go and do a report on how it shoots, one, you don't want to have to go through this long hellacious thing of paper tuning, bare shaft tuning, walk back tuning, then does it group? The reality was, from all my testing of doing it that way and including on bows that won medals for me, my shortcuts, like everyone wants to know the hack and everyone wants to know the shortcut. I'm going to tell you my shortcut, James, and you tell me whether or not I'm missing something, because I want people listening to this podcast to 100%. Like, if I'm not doing it right, I want to get corrected. You know what I mean?
sure.
I want to know. So what I've found is paper tuning is the best thing I know for starting point, because One, if you don't have a good tear through paper and you make an adjustment and the tear doesn't change, you immediately know that there's something that is either contacting or something not going right with the launch of that arrow. There's interference. And if there's a clearance issue or a timing issue on the rest, then everything else you do for the next 2 weeks is going to just be a headache, because paper identifies, for me, more so than anything, arrow rest placement and clearance issues. That's what it indicates. It, or technique issues. If you've got a ridiculous face pressure and you're having to set your arrow shaft pointing all the way over to
Yeah.
10 o'clock on the next target in order to get a bullet hole, this is giving you indicators that something's not right. So
Yes.
for me, I start with paper, I line it down the pipe. My nock is at 90 degrees. Certain bows, I like the starting placement of my arrow at different positions on a burger buttonhole, depending on the type of brand of bow and where their grip is naturally placed in the riser versus that arrow rest mounting position. So I may start my up and down point according to the where it's relative to your riser shelf. I might be a little higher on one bow model than another, but I'll get that figured out first, and it will be set at 90 degrees when I tie my knocking points. Then I look over the top of the bow, and I want my arrow shaft running down the center of my string and the center of my tiller bolts, and ideally, if the riser's straight and if the stabilizers are straight, there's a very, very good chance your arrow shaft's going to be within the center line of your stabilizer. Now, if you have that and you're within an 1/8 inch tear, and if you make a little adjustment and that tear just instantly, okay, now I have a perfect bullet hole, this is great news. You have a rest that is responding to the direction you're moving it. The arrow is immediately reacting to that rest position. So you know that you've got a projectile that has a launch pad that is giving it direction and is not interfering with it. And from there, honestly, I'll normally go out and, me personally, I will sight in at 20, print out a tape, go to 60, print out a tape, and I'll just go to 100 and start lobbing some bombs. What I look for, and the first thing that I really check when I'm deciding whether this arrow is happy with its counterpart, the bow, is I plot the left and right variation of my groups. I don't really make adjustments to the rest much. I'll just check lefts and rights. Let's say at 100 yards, I've got a 8-inch variation. Then the next thing that I'll do is I would take that same arrow and go change the point weight about 25 grains up or down, or I would change the pulling weight of my bow about 3.5 pounds. And I would then shoot groups again and try to recognize whether that horizontal variance of my impact grew or shrunk. And that initial thing of whether it goes wider or narrower will automatically tell me whether my spine was too stiff or too weak to begin with, or possibly just perfectly right. And so once you start to realize, okay, well, actually, when I put 25 more grains in the point of this arrow, my groups actually tighten together. Well, then the next thing you can do is either go to 50 grain point and see if it does it even better, or if you have the option, go to that next weaker spine back with the original point weight and shoot it down there and see if you get this same tight group. Now, for me, that indicator right there seems to always put me at the same exact endpoint at the longer distances as if I go down an entire rat hole of bear shaft testing, because at least for me, I feel like the mass majority of consumers don't have good enough technique with a
No, they don't.
compound bow to go down a bear shaft testing, because even if you just put tape on the back to add the weight, that is still not the same, right?
Yes. What I typically do, John, I do paper testing. I do the initial setup and the paper testing exactly as you described,
Okay.
and then I'll usually put the bow in my shooting machine and
Of course you do.
try that. Because I find a
Yes.
lot of archers they get the bow hand not right,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
and if something's going wrong, it's often that their bow hand's incorrect. So I'll fix that first. Then once I've got a behaviour through paper that I like, usually I'll go straight to 50 meters or 50 yards or so and look at the arrow flight. And
Yeah.
usually I'm looking at it visually.
Yeah. Yeah. So um what causes an arrow? There's times where an arrow will get out there at about like 40 or 50 yards, and sometimes it almost looks like I don't know if that's the point where maybe it finally corrects like a snake bend that you're not seeing with the naked eye, but certainly with lit nocks, there's times where you can see almost at a mid-distance point that arrow becomes unstable. What do you think that's relative to?
If you get a very long, if you get the very long distances, as the arrow slows down, you can get some aerodynamic uh, differences where the type of flow changes along the shaft, for example. And if that happens and it gets near the center of mass of the arrow, funny things can happen. So you don't want to go near that. Uh,
Okay, so
uh,
that what that's showing is so that's pretty much showing there comes a point. I'm trying to like, I don't want to say dumb it down, but some of the hunters out there when they hear X10s, they're like, what the hell are they talking about? Let alone this. So
yeah,
imagine, you have this arrow that has something on the front of it steering, potentially steering it,
yes,
something on the back of it potentially steering it, and at
yes.
a certain speed, one of those things is the deciding factor of who's got the wheel and who's
Well,
driving this baby, right?
I'll give you an example, John.
Okay.
One of the tests I did in wind tunnels at university was I suspended an arrow in the wind tunnel and then looked at how it behaved as we changed the airspeed. Now,
Right.
in changing the airspeed, what was changing was uh, where the changes in the airflow happened along the shaft, and if those changes got near the center of mass, the arrow behaved wildly.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
So there are strange things that can happen, and you want to stay away from them.
Okay.
Uh, so
Now,
I think sometimes when we get, for example, arrows with high drag,
yeah.
uh, some of those things can happen, and yeah, I think then you can see some of these nasty behaviours.
And by high drag, everybody, he's talking about severe fletch angle
Yep.
translates to high drag once it gets to a certain distance.
Yes, it can.
Okay. Um, but again, depending on how that arrow is flexing and what's in the front of it, sometimes that can be
Yes.
minimized, but sometimes it's also maximized. So I actually that question came from someone who DM'd me, and he's been out shooting his lit nocks with different broadheads, and there's certain ones where he's like, these things shoot so good, but watch what it does at that distance. And the thing is, the steering of the front of that arrow, once it slows down enough, it is beginning to take control over the back end of that steering. And that's when this real shift in like who gets the wheel to the car happens,
Sure.
is what James is describing. So there's so many factors. So lately you've been doing some studies on what makes you miss. How
Yes.
have you made final conclusions? Are there a few things that you want to like?
Yeah, I've come to the conclusion that there are four key things,
Oh, sweet.
four key reasons why people lose score. And one of those is that the lateral angle,
Canting the
regard
bow.
the bow cant.
Okay. Teach the hell out of that.
If that varies too much, especially at long range, it'll kill you.
James,
And
have you done that on the shooting machine? Have you done half quarter bubble, half bubble, full bubble?
Yes, I
at
have.
90
Yeah,
meters.
I have.
So
Yeah, I have. And
only with X10s?
I've done it. Well, I've done all the maths, so I can do it applicable to any arrow, basically.
Okay.
And
So
but I've done it. I've done the shooting test with the shooting machine, but I've also analysed it mathematically. And what it's telling me is that for a good archer, you want to keep that variation less than a quarter of a degree. It's pretty tight.
man, dude, if I filmed behind like 9,800 of the people I was behind
Yeah,
and we had a little graph on there showing that they would crap their pants.
pretty high.
But see,
Like
here's the thing. It's like to me, I would way rather have any archer going out and focusing on this test, that spending a whole week doing nothing but focusing on their vertical bow alignment at, not honestly how you present to the target. So, one of the things I do, James, for some of my students, I have a few students when I'm behind them and I see them start to tip that limb outside of their essentially outside of their shoulder. If
yeah,
I'm looking at them from the back, if they're getting in the habit of drawing that outside of that silhouette and bringing it back, I actually put them right up against a wall,
so they
and
can't do it.
I just say, listen, you have to shoot all day down the edge of this wall, and you have to just learn
Yes,
to raise your bow and draw this thing back without hitting that
yes,
or hitting that.
yeah. A
Um,
couple of things I would do, John. Like one of the very best archers that we've ever had is Clint Freeman, as you mentioned.
for sure.
I've talked to Clint. I've talked to Clint a lot about bow count variation, and he watched the bubble at least as much as he watched the sight.
Well, I do too. Did you? I don't know if you saw. So I did. I did a video about a month ago, which for some reason I'd never really brought this out before, and I don't know why, but I call it a 6 to 9 drill. So I talked about front sight, rear sight orientation and how I do it. So what I told people was when you're aligning your front sight and your rear sight, it's a circle. And you
Yes.
don't want to look all the way around that thing because it's
No.
kind of like, if you start taking your eyes off the end line of the road, you start swerving all over the place. So what I
Sure.
tell people is when I pull up, I get my pin to the target and I
Yep.
check in with my alignment on my peep at 6 o'clock. Then I check it at 9 o'clock. Then I go back to the pin. Then I go
Sure.
pin bubble, 6, 9, pin bubble, back to pin. So
Sure.
I only check in at 2 points of that 360-degree radius. I check in at 6 o'clock and I check in at 9. Some people can't
Sure.
check in at 3 because their cables are in the way. So I literally tell people you have a full pie, but you really only have to use 25% of that pie. But once you've checked in at 6 and 9, from that point on, your mentality has to just go from pin to bubble to pin, pin to
Yep.
bubble to pin.
Yep. Absolutely.
And that's critical. And that's why some of these, honestly, there's some sites on the market right now that everybody's gravitating to. And the level is so far from the pin that I'm telling people this costs you accuracy.
Yeah. No good.
It
No
is
good.
not good. It is not
No.
good.
Now the other thing I tell them, John, is that there's a natural angle that we hold the bow at,
Okay.
and if we hold the bow at that angle, which might not be vertical, of course,
Right.
uh, we're going to get less variation. But your sight bow must be vertical. Because
Right.
if your sight
Yep.
bow is not vertical, of course, as you change distance, you go off to the side.
Yeah.
Uh, so you don't necessarily set the sight bar at the same angle of the bow. You set the sight bar so it must be vertical, but you
Right.
set the bow angle to your natural angle of holding it, and then
Right.
your variation will be less and you lose less score.
Right. Yep. Very good call. And also why here's something you can do for those of you listening. Um, I don't want to say brands, but all I'm going to tell you is this. If you have your front sight and when you move it, if your bubble responds immediately, that is good.
Yeah,
if your bubble is made of a substance that's so thick where even if there's a 1 second delay in that movement, that is a huge accuracy killer. Your bubble needs to be made of a material that is liquid and instant in its response to your movement. There cannot be a
yeah.
delay.
Now, I mean, I mentioned that that's one of the things that I found is one of the four key areas of score loss. Another one that I find is you know quite a major score loss for archers is that they simply don't set their sights correctly.
I know. That's true too. I see that all the time. I
Yeah,
tell people, I'm like, "Oh, hey, I feel, you're on 99, not 100. Oh no, it's
yeah,
close enough." I'm like, dude, honestly, with this 610 or 680 grain arrow, 1 yard is like a foot, feet, not one foot. It is feet. It is feet.
yeah, yeah.
So very
So
cool.
I get very fussy with particularly I'm mostly watching people shooting target or field.
Right.
Yeah, that if their arrow is not in the middle, change the sight. And they just
Yeah.
don't. Now,
Yeah.
you take one of the world's best archers is Mike Slosser. I've watched him a lot standing behind. If
Yeah.
you if his arrow didn't hit the center of the X, he changes the sight. Uh, but most archers will put up with their groups being off center and they're just giving away a huge score.
Yeah, it's those are two like super obvious ones. Super
Yeah,
obvious ones. Um, so what's the other? Are you wanting to give them all away? I don't want to like
yeah.
ruin your thing. Those are two awesome ones. Those are two such
They're
good
obvious,
ones.
aren't they? They
Yeah,
just don't do
and
it.
honestly, even what we talked about with the wrist position at the front, you
Yeah,
know, this like I bet you 2 decades ago I wrote an article about your hands, and
yeah,
honestly the bow hand in my opinion is the first and the last thing to determine the path of that arrow. It's
yes,
the first thing that it's the first thing that bow is collapsing against when the release is fired, and it's the last physical thing that the bow is contacting when that arrow
yes,
leaves. So
yeah.
that front
Well,
bow hand is an
matters a heap.
absolute, right?
Yes, it is. Now, the other two I mentioned before that I've come to the conclusion. Um, Now, my game is long range target,
Right.
and it's dealing with wind drift. You're not dealing with wind drift perfectly. And so what that means is that's basically equipment optimization. That's minimizing the wind drift of arrows. That's using skinny arrows with uh, heavier mass. That's
Yeah.
using an
Yeah.
X10 with a 120 grains or so.
So let me
And
bring this up. Well, I don't want to change your subject, but remind me about micro diameter and Knox. That's
sure.
before I forget, that's what I wanted to talk to you about too.
Well, let's do that now, John.
Oh, okay. Okay. So when it comes to like hunting shafts, for sure a smaller diameter is going to help with penetration. It's
Yes,
definitely going to help with ballistics downrange, wind drift.
yes, yes, it will.
So for me, the reason I'm not in a 4 millimeter arrow shaft, there's actually two reasons. And both of the reasons I'm not in a 4 millimeter arrow shaft from a hunting point of view is mainly because of what's happening on both ends. I'm not a big outsert person, just because for alignment, I've dealt with that all the way back to like the Beam and Diva C's and things like that.
Yes,
But also, they're just not great on bag targets. And when I travel and go to an archery club, I'm at the mercy of what every club has for their targets. And sometimes having outserts and especially losing an outsert in a target pretty much ruins that target for life.
yes,
So I don't particularly like them for that reason. But the other reason comes down to I really, really like lit nocks. I feel like from a hunting point of view, one of the most ethical things you can do is be able to totally confirm impact point. on that animal before you attempt your tracking. And I feel like a lighted knock can help in recovery, if it's right at last light and you have to go around, you can find your arrow that's laying on the ground. Immediately you're within the realm of blood. I think there's a lot of great things, but in saying that, with a lot of with all the lit knocks that I found, a lit knock, because of how they're comprised, they are not as stiff as factory knocks that are completely solid. And on the 4 millimeter specifically, if you grab a lit knock on a 4 millimeter and flex this, it has a lot of movement, and it's the actual knock itself being very, very teeny, not much plastic meat around it at all, and it's long. And so if you can bend that up and down,
No
you
good.
have completely changed the
Yes.
tune of this arrow.
Yes. No good.
Um, and not in a good way. I mean,
No.
so a flexible knock to a doctor in aerodynamics. What does that spell
No, no
out for
good.
you?
I've done a lot of testing of knocks because they matter a great deal.
Yeah.
And what all my testing has shown is that the from the back of the arrow, you want a short distance to the knock groove.
Yep.
It gets straight back to what you meant it is, flex and how well the knock's made.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and some knocks are well in the group testing with shooting machine with different knocks. Some will have groups twice the size of others.
Yeah.
It, there are big, big, big differences.
Yeah. You can take a
And
bow
so
shooting like this, and then just next thing you know, it's
great big
just
differences. So
splatter and shotgun patterns
and
just
what
from
it
the
say what it
knocks.
tells me is the distance from the knock groove back to the rear of the shaft. You want to have or to the back of a pin, for example. You want to have that distance very short.
Right. Which is why, like, on our target arrows, uh, these little pin knock systems right here, you have a
Yep.
very robust peg coming out of the
Yep.
shaft that's then immediately to the knock groove. So you're
That's
really
right.
minimizing your option to flex.
That's right. Now, what I've found is for example, one of the archers I coach is Pat Coughlin.
Yeah,
He
yeah,
was world number two at one stage.
yeah.
At one stage, we got every brand of knocks that Pat could lay his hands on, and I tested all of them. And I would be fussy as to which ones I used because some are much, much better than others.
Yeah, I know, man. I know, and I try to tell people that there's some very good ones out. And honestly, there's some good brands that have multiple
Yes, there are.
designs, and some
Yes.
designs aren't as good as what the company is because of that design.
Uh, yeah,
We're
absolutely, John.
I think we're talking about the same place. Um,
Absolutely.
although I did find that at times with X10s, it seems like with X10s you can either be just right or you can be too stiff or too weak real fast.
Yeah.
And there was a certain knock that I think you and I are talking about the same company, but they actually made one that was pretty soft. And I needed, if I put that knock in the arrow that was reacting a little bit too stiff, the flex of the knock was like just enough to where it grouped. So I shot that. Not, I know we're talking about the same
Yeah. Yeah. One of
place.
the one of the things I've come to the conclusion is that in choosing my gear there, I would test it with shooting machine.
Yeah, I know. Well, I broke mine out. It's right over there. I figured
Yeah.
if what I naturally come out and say to everybody in this whole arrow world right now, if what I'm doing, like, I tell people, I'm like, listen, I have a hunting bow, and I'm shooting
Yeah.
for you guys at 70 and 70 meters today. I did 100, so I did 90 meters. I'm like, listen, this is as real as it gets. Can I put this in a
Yes.
shooting machine and show you? Yes, but there's also like in order to save us 100 times more time, I can do it. There's not a lot of people that can, but if I
You
make a
got you
bad
got the
shot,
advantage. You got a nice advantage there, John, and that you're a good enough archer that you can do tests just shooting. And
yeah,
some of us can't do that.
yeah, but I mean, it's a difference between, hey, here's how it really affects you with a mechanical
Yeah,
error, or yes, I can put it in a shooting machine as long as there's no wind variation, as long as I'm
sure,
using a plunger, these are going to shoot in the same spot. So
sure.
I've got two more topics I'm curious on. So one of the topics is there's a lot of people out here that are convincing people to like float their arrows, find high spine, weigh every single arrow. And honestly, what I'm trying to tell people is if you buy a match grade arrow, the honestly 99% of the population is not going to be able to understand the difference of what this arrow can do downrange. Now, certainly
Right now
there's, go ahead.
on the weighing arrows, one of my published papers, I've analysed that, and if you look at the real top archer, uh, what do they have to do? Now, you're looking at world class archer. What do they have to do? And what I would do there is I'd say you got a target archer using say X10s.
Yep.
I would get the X10s. I would make them up, fletch them, not put the points in. I'd weigh them, and I'd weigh the points, and I'd put the heaviest point with the lightest shaft, etc. And that will be accurate enough. You don't need to
Yeah.
do more than you
Yeah.
don't need to go to the extremes.
The machines now to, so here's the thing. If you're buying a match grade arrow, they are
Good
doing that
enough.
for you. They are
Yes,
doing
they
that
are.
for you. There might be the occasional arrow where what I tell people is the best thing you can do is just when you fletch up your, and honestly, if you buy this arrow right here from us that's made this way, every one that I shoot, I go and grab out of the bucket at work. I don't do any
Yeah.
of this stuff. I promise
No.
you, what I'm hunting with and everything, that's what I do. These were all like R&D protocols and part
Yes.
of Easton's ISO freaking protocols for their
Yes.
MRP. These are protocols that have to be in place. And what matters to
Yeah.
me the most is spine consistency.
I
Spine
agree.
consistency is definitely important, but when you're
Yes,
within
it is.
plus or minus 1 thousandths for straightness and for
Yes.
weight,
Yes.
people
Good enough.
go out
Good
there
enough.
and get 20 more minutes of practice in.
I
And
agree, John. Better
and
better
if
to
you,
do the practice than to fiddle around
yeah,
with
and
some of
if
these other
number
things.
two gets wild, and every time you shoot number two, it's left to the group, turn that knock 90 degrees, shoot it
Yes.
again, see if it brings it back in the middle. You know what? If for some reason, after you've done that 3 times, if number two always still goes left, then
Chuck it
mark that
out.
thing with a, I've got arrows that have question mark on it. Normally, out of 3 or 4 dozen, I might have one that I question whether
Yes.
it's me or if it's just by chance. But
Yes.
honestly, like that, these companies are making, if you're buying their premium arrows, they're so freaking good. We're not
They are good.
literally making wooden arrows anymore.
They are actually good enough. You don't need to go to the extremes.
Right. And like so then the last thing I was going to tell you, and this is one of the things, if I were to add one of the things that make people miss or inaccurate, the one thing that I think people don't, the people that are thinking about arrows and being picky about arrows, the one thing that you do not spend enough time on that you should is knock fit to the serving.
Yes, I agree.
This connection, if anyone's going to have an argument on what it should be, that connection is more critical to groups than anything, because depending on your bow's natural string tension, depending if you've backed your limbs out 5 turns or 10 turns, or honestly, the natural geometry of that bow, if that knock is spreading apart to snap on and it's building a flat rudder on your serving, That
Yeah, no good.
arrow is so unpredictable compared to
Yes,
one that just lightly pops on and freely
yes,
spins within the throat of the nock.
yes, yes. I agree, John. Matters a lot.
So I would tell people, if you're going to be fanatical about your arrows, you would be so much better off taking this brand new bowstring that you bought and got it sent to your house out of a package and checking how that thing fits that arrow. That fit right there is way more critical to accuracy than you putting your arrows in a bathtub and floating
I
them or
I
matching
absolutely agree.
points.
Absolutely agree, John. I don't worry. Yeah, bathtubs and things. I just don't go near them.
So you told me about paper tuning for just and then you go to the shooting machine for your tuning
Yes,
process.
yes,
With a compound bow, see, with a compound, I just have like kind of lost my ability to keep wasting time with bear shaft tuning because I feel like the arrow charts have gotten so much better that you're
yes,
within a very small window of this arrow being responsive to you. So now
yes,
three 3.5 pounds of pull weight is almost equal to a spine to changing
yes,
an arrow one spine. So if you change your poundage up 3.5 pounds or down 3.5 pounds and instantly see how that arrow responds, you're going to know whether your arrow was too stiff and you had to lower weight in order to get it to come together, or maybe it was, or sorry, if it was too stiff and all of a sudden you added weight and that thing just sucked together, well, now you know you need a little bit weaker spine if at your ideal weight. Or if you had to lower weight, you know, okay, well, I was actually too weak. And by lowering the weight, I let that arrow stiffen up a little bit. Now I got the results I want. So maybe what I need to do is either lower my poundage, lower my point weight. Maybe I should go to that stiffer spine. Like there's now you know your direction. Now, when I
yes,
learned to recurve, 100%, like the type of string material you're using, how fast that thing came off your fingers,
yes,
your plunger stiffness, that stuff started to factor into bear shaft tuning really fast. But for a
yeah. But
compound that
it's
has a completely,
yes.
opposite paradox, I just
Yes.
feel like if people pay
Oh,
attention to the paper, pay attention to groups downrange, and then honestly, the last thing that I'll do if I ever feel like for some reason my sight isn't tracking is I'll maybe do a slight French tune or a walk back tuning method to make sure my shorter distances and my longer distances are all bang on with my
yeah.
sight.
Yeah. I say recurve, I definitely go to bare shaft, but not
Mm,
for compound. Uh,
right.
Compound, I'm more interested in what's the arrow flight look like.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
I'm
because
it's
it's so much
after it,
faster too.
I like to get out at 50 meters or so and stand behind and watch, see what the arrow's doing.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's why we're out on this call because I was standing behind a lot of people watching their arrows past 50 meters and I wasn't super thrilled about what I was seeing. And then when
Yeah.
I'd go pull the arrow out of the target, as soon as I saw the front of it, I'm like, oh no, they're drinking the Kool-Aid and they're more worried about an abbreviation FOC than they are about accuracy and
Yeah.
grouping and arrows in the middle of the target and knowing that they're going to do that. So this has
Sure.
been so refreshing, James. I'm so glad to connect with you again, and I hope we see each other sometime here
Yeah.
soon.
Yeah.
I need to get
Good,
you
John.
over to a total archery challenge. I think you would just absolutely love it. Love seeing the atmosphere.
Yeah.
It would be so refreshing for you.
Yep.
Very cool. Well,
Good.
thanks, James. I appreciate it. Hey, where can people find you if they need to find James Park and some of your Dr. James Park, I apologize.
Yeah. Yeah,
uh
that's right. Like if they want to find any of my papers, they can always do a search on Google Scholar and look under J.L. Park Archery, and they'll find all of them.
there it is. Okay, people, this is a friend of mine for 20 years and he's literally made a life out of this. I have too, but I just don't know the why. I just know what it does on a piece of paper when it hits it, puts a hole. I want all my holes in the same spot. So that's how I figured it out. I figured it out the shooting way. He figured it out the
The
scientific way
mathematics.
with ridiculous math equations, a shooting machine, and I still do not know how you've fixed a camera's shutter to the exact timing of a bow to be able to get pictures of arrow flight in exact moments of time. You're a freaking genius.
Yeah, good
I
fun.
love that. I love that. And maybe I'll post that. So James got a picture for me of an arrow going through the center of an egg yolk.
We have.
How the heck you did that, I have no idea. But that was
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, James. I
Okay, John.
appreciate it. Knock on, everybody.
Great.
Be sure to check out knockonarchery.com for our full line of custom designed products, as well as free in-depth education and bow hunting entertainment to help you shoot at your best.